Good morning, and thank you ever so much for joining us today for our bite-sized webinar on the subject of philanthropy and setting up a charitable foundation. My name is Liz Brownsell, and I'm Head of Charities at Birketts, and I'm here today with my colleague Jen.
Hello, I'm Jen Marley. I'm a Senior Associate in the Charity Team at Birketts.
Thanks, Jen. So you're going to be with us for about the next half an hour, and what we're going to do today is talk you through some of the key considerations if you're looking at setting up a charitable foundation. Now, you might be here as an individual, thinking about setting up your own foundation, thinking about setting up a family foundation, or perhaps a corporate foundation for your business. Whatever it is, we're hopefully going to cover some of the key things that you need to think about. At the end of the session, at the end of our presentation, there will be an opportunity for us to answer your questions. So if you do have any questions as we progress through the slides, please do pop them into the question box. And if you have any technical difficulties at all, then please put a question in the chat and the technical team will try to support you. So on the slide here is the agenda for what we're going to cover this morning. It's a very high-level overview. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about why you might want to set up a charitable foundation, and then we're going to go on and talk about the key considerations for you. What we won't do is cover all of the technical steps in actually setting up a charity. And the reason for that is that there's a huge amount of guidance on that on the Charity Commission website. So if you do decide to do it on your own, it's quite easy to follow all of that. But in our experience, a lot of philanthropists do choose to instruct professional advisors to help them when they are ready to set up a charity. And what our aim is today is to arm you with the information that you need to make sure that that advice is as cost effective as possible. Because if you can go to your professional advisor with a clear idea of what you want to do, it does help to keep costs to a minimum. So that's our aim for today. So to begin, I'm going to have a look at why you might like to set up a charitable foundation. So, of course, there are lots and lots of different ways that philanthropists can give back and give to charity. And by philanthropy, I don't just mean giving away your wealth. It can be your time, it can be assets, it can be sharing your network, making introductions, helping with fundraising. Loads of different things, in my mind, fall within what I would describe as philanthropic activity. What we're talking about today is very specifically giving away your wealth into a charitable foundation. And where you're looking to do that, there are other options that you might want to consider before you decide to set up a foundation of your own. The most obvious first option is to just give direct. There are loads of charities out there, and you'll hear often people talking about there are too many charities on the register and we need to consolidate them. And there are a lot of those sorts of views out there in the marketplace. And that is true to a large extent. So if there is a charity that you want to support, why not just give them directly? Now, there are lots of reasons why people choose to set up a foundation rather than just making direct donations. And some of those, and some of the main ones of those, are tax related. There are lots and lots of fantastic groups out there, community groups, other social enterprises, lots of organizations that are not themselves charitable, but are undertaking charitable activities and charitable projects as a part of what their wider activities are. And it may be that you want to support one of those. If so, giving directly to a non-charitable body for a charitable purpose would not be eligible for gift aid. And so giving through your foundation, so if you set up a foundation, put the funds into the foundation first, and then the foundation supports those causes, it is more tax efficient. It makes your money go further because your donation into the foundation is eligible for gift aid. So that's one of the first advantages. Similarly, in terms of timing, when you are directly giving, even if you're giving to a charity where it is eligible for gift aid, that gift aid is only applicable at the time of the donation. Now, that might not be the most tax efficient way for you because it may be that you want to give a donation before the end of the financial year, but you're not quite ready to do that yet. And so it falls in the wrong tax year for you in terms of tax efficiencies. Of course, with your own foundation, you can time your donations into the foundation whenever it suits you and then make donations and grants out of the foundation again when you're ready to and when your foundation has identified a suitable recipient. Similarly, with investments, if you're looking at putting a large sum of money into build up an endowment to do good with, investing that through a foundation is far more tax efficient because the gains, the capital gains and the income returns on that investment are eligible for reliefs within a foundation, which would not be available to you as an individual or a business. The other advantage of having your own foundation is you can try to attract donations from others, whether that's family members, staff within your organisation, for example. So you can pool your resources, pool all of that wealth and make it go further. And then, of course, there's the personal satisfaction of having your own charity and having that commitment to really doing good and making a difference. Now, all of those advantages that I've just listed about having your own foundation apply equally to setting up a fund. And I really want to emphasize the importance of considering either a donor advised fund or a community foundation fund before you think about setting up your own foundation. It is a fantastic option for many people, and it may be absolutely perfect for you. So I would encourage you to have a conversation with your local community foundation or a donor advised fund to find out about the services they offer and see whether or not it is suitable for you. There are some differences. The main ones are around control. With a fund, what it means is that you have a personal fund that you are the donor for, and it sits within a much bigger charity with lots and lots and lots of individual funds within it. And the board of trustees of that foundation manages all of those funds. So you have got a little less control than you would have in your own foundation. There are advantages though, because if you want to have less involvement, you want to be less involved in the day-to-day management and administration of the monies, then with a fund, they do all of that for you. It also reduces risk because you're not a charity trustee subject to those duties and responsibilities. Now, for some people, that's a real plus. For some people, actually, that's perhaps a con, and they would rather have those responsibilities and they would rather have more involvement. And similarly on transparency, being a fund within a large donor advised fund or foundation, it's far less transparent than having your own charity. And again, for some people that's an advantage and for some it's a disadvantage. The final point to consider is cost. If you're putting a very large sum of money into a foundation, setting it up as a fund within a donor advised fund or a community foundation, they tend to charge on a percentage basis. So you would want to have a look at the cost involved of doing that and decide whether perhaps having your own foundation may be better for you if you're prepared to do the administration and the management yourselves, or perhaps pay for an external provider to provide support with that. And at Birketts, we do have a charity administration and clerking service for grant making charities, should that be of interest. So once you've considered all of the options and decided what is the right course of action for you, if you do want to go down the route of setting up your own foundation, what are the key considerations for you to think about? And at this point, I'm going to hand over to Jen, who's going to talk you through some of those key considerations. She's going to tell you a little bit about thinking about what charitable purposes to choose, the governance arrangements and the different options in terms of legal form. So Jen, over to you.
Thanks very much, Liz. So one of the first things that you will need to think about is what your objects are. So for a charity, the objects are the part of the governing document that describes what the charity is going to do, and all of the assets of the charity need to be used to further your objects. When deciding on objects, you need to pick something that is recognised as charitable in law, and it also needs to be applied for the benefit of the public, which Liz will talk about a bit later on. So for grant-making charities, there's sort of two key considerations really. One option is that you can have general charitable purposes, which will allow the charity to pursue anything that's recognised as charitable in law. One of the other options is that you can be more specific. If you know what you want to focus on, then you can include that in your objects. For example, you might want to set up a foundation that's going to focus on the advancement of education. One of the key points to consider around this is if you put specific objects in your governing document, it can be very difficult or impossible to change that later. Whereas if you have general charitable purposes, you can then use a grant-making policy to direct how the charity is going to apply its assets, and the trustees can change that without needing to go to the Charity Commission for consent. So whichever option you're choosing, you will need a grant-making policy when you apply to register with the Charity Commission. Either a fully fledged policy or at least an outline policy, and we often help people with drafting those. And some of the key points that need to be covered in those policies are what area you're going to focus on for now if you have general charitable purposes, the eligibility criteria for applicants, the application process, and the selection criteria for when you're deciding between applicants. So these are all things that you need to have an idea about before you start setting up your charity. So you've got an idea of who you want to help and how you might identify people and how you might choose between them. So one of the next things to look at, oops, skipped ahead there, is to think about your governance structure. So as you may all know, the Board of Trustees in a charity has day-to-day management of the charity. And when you're thinking about setting up a charitable foundation, you need to think about who your trustees might be and how many of them you might want to have. So the Charity Commission recommends a minimum of 3 and a maximum of 12. You need to think about the skills and experience that you need on your board. If you're setting up a charitable foundation for your family, for example, do you want your trustees to all be family members? And if they are all family members, will you have the right mix of skills and experience needed on your board? Or do you need to think about bringing some external people in? If you're setting up a corporate foundation, do you want people from the corporate body to sit as trustees? And how will you manage conflicts of interest, which is a point my colleague Liz will talk about a bit later on. And then sitting alongside that, you need to think about who's going to have the power to appoint these trustees and how long they're going to be appointed for. So for example, if you're setting up a family charitable foundation, it might be that you want the founder of the charity during their lifetime to have a power to appoint trustees. If you're setting up a corporate foundation, you might want that power to sit with the corporate, or you might want the trustees as a body to decide who they need on the board from time to time. And then sitting alongside that, some charitable structures, which I'll talk about in a moment, also have members who have certain rights in relation to the governance of the charity. So the members sit above the trustees, and they might, for example, appoint the trustees, and they also normally have the power to decide on changes to the governing document. So again, if you're picking a structure where you have members, you'll need to just think about who is going to be the member or members and what rights are they going to have, and are there specific things that you want to have to go up to the membership for approval. So for example, if you are setting up a corporate charitable foundation, the corporate body might be the member, and you might want certain decisions to have to go up to the corporate body for approval. And these are just all things to think about ahead of setting up the charity, and points that we can advise on and discuss further with you as needed. So that brings us on to having a look at some of the main options that are available in terms of what form your charity might take. So being a charity is not itself a legal form, it's a wrapper that sits around a number of different legal forms. And for charitable foundations, we think that the main options are either a charitable trust, a charitable company, which is a company limited by guarantee, or a charitable incorporated organisation, otherwise referred to as a CIO. So just taking each of those in turn, the charitable trust, that is relatively quick and simple to set up. It just requires a declaration of trust. It is unincorporated, and that means that it has no legal personality of its own. So the trustees will then need to hold the property of the trust, and the trustees will need to enter into any contracts in their own name and sue and be sued in their own name, and there is unlimited liability for trustees. The main advantage really of a charitable trust is that it is very quick and easy to set up. It doesn't need to be registered with the Charity Commission until it has income of over £5,000 a year. And also, just to bear in mind that a charitable trust is affected by trust law and charity law, and that can also be beneficial. So a charitable trust could be set up, for example, during the lifetime of a donor, and it could be, during the lifetime, it could accumulate the income of any investments that it has, and then it might be set up in such a way that the donors estate is then left to the charity on their death, and at that point, that's when the charity starts to make grants and actively start furthering its charitable objects. One of the other options to think about is a charitable company or a CIO. I'm going to start looking at those together because they're quite similar. They are both corporate bodies, which means they have their own legal personality, they hold property in their own name, they enter into contracts in their own name, they sue and can be sued in their own name, and the trustees benefit from limited liability. Now looking at the differences between them, so a charitable company needs to be registered first with Companies House and then with the Charity Commission once it has income of over £5,000 a year. That does mean it can be set up relatively quickly at Companies House if there was a need to put money into the charity in a short time frame. I'm just going to move on to the next slide, which shows you some of the difference in the process. And if you want to set up a CIO, that needs to be registered with the Charity Commission before it comes into existence. There's no minimum income requirement there. Once it's registered, it comes into existence and it can then start carrying out its charitable activities. Going forward, a charitable company will need to report to both Companies House and the Charity Commission, but a CIO only needs to report to the Charity Commission. So those are some of the main things to think about and consider. What sort of structure do you want? What sort of level of reporting and administration are you happy with going forward? And is there an urgent need to open something to put money into straight away? Or can you wait to set up a CIO and do it that way? Just in terms of time frame for a CIO, that can take many months to set up. The Charity Commission has quite a backlog and it can take a number of months. So that is not a quick option. But then going forward, you've only got the reporting to the Charity Commission to think about. So a number of options there. And again, we can talk you through those if you want to look at the options in more detail. So I'm now going to hand back to Liz, and she's going to talk you through a bit more about the public benefit requirement and some points around conflicts of interest.
Hi, thanks, Jen. Yes, so now having a little look at that public benefit requirement, which Jen mentioned earlier. So this is a core part of what it means to be a charity. In order to be a charity in England and Wales, your institution has to be established for wholly and exclusively charitable purposes for the public benefit. So you have to satisfy that test on registration, but it's an ongoing requirement. That means your charity has to always satisfy it. You have to continually operate for the public benefit, and you have to report every year on what your charity has done for the public benefit. So because of that requirement, we recommend for grant-making charities particularly that you look to incorporate within any grants that you make out of the charity reporting obligations so that you are aware of how those funds have been applied and the impact critically of those grants. So what good has been achieved from the grant that you've made so that you can report on that as part of your public benefit reporting duties. When you're setting up a grant-making charity, particularly with general charitable purposes, it's generally quite easy to satisfy the main principles of being a charity for the public benefit. So I'm not going to dwell too much on that. You need to be able to show that there's an identifiable benefit or benefits that's to the public generally or to a sufficient section of the public. And most general purpose grant-making charities meet those requirements quite easily. The bit I'm going to look at in more detail is the sort of other side of the coin, which is the requirement for there not to be more than an incidental personal benefit. And that's a very core part of the public benefit test. And we see that with its sort of related duty to manage and avoid conflicts of interests. There are some particular considerations to be mindful of if you're setting up a foundation as an individual with your family or with your business. So the first thing to think about in terms of conflicts is the donations that you are making into the foundation once it's been established. When that happens, you've got two hats on. You've got your donor hat on the one side, and then you have your trustee hat on the other, assuming that you are going to be a trustee of the charity you found. In that scenario, if you're making an unrestricted grant into your charity, sort of donation rather than grant into your charity, then there aren't really any particular considerations, because you're just saying, here's the money and the trustees can decide what to do with it. But if you want to put any restrictions around that donation, for example, you particularly want it to be used for a specific cause or directed to a particular organisation, then there is a conflict of interest, because your wishes as a donor may not necessarily be in the best interests of the charitable foundation, and the trustees need to consider independently whether it is appropriate for the foundation to accept the donation subject to those restrictions. Now, you cannot sit on both sides of that decision, and so what it means is, on the trustee side, you have to declare a conflict and not participate in the decision about whether or not to accept the donation on the proposed terms. If you set up a charity with only family members as the trustees, then everybody is subject to that same conflict, because your family members would be conflicted by virtue of their relationship with you. So it's important to consider that and to think about whether or not you do need to have some independent trustees on the board if you're likely to want to make donations that are subject to restrictions. Other key considerations are at the other side of it. So once the money is in the foundation and you're making decisions as a group of trustees about investments, you have to be quite careful not to have more than an incidental personal benefit through any of your investment decision activities. So for example, if as a group of trustees you were to decide, and you participated in the decision, to invest into a company in which you also personally held substantial shares, then there would clearly be a personal benefit to you, which may put you in breach of your duties as a charity trustee. So you have to take particular care about the decisions on investment. And then similarly with grant making and selection of beneficiaries, you have to be careful not to select beneficiaries that are connected to you in any way, unless it is within the realms of a grant making policy and you haven't participated in the decision. It may be acceptable to do that, but you wouldn't want to have too much of that. So if a lot of the people receiving benefits from the charity were connected with you in some way, then that would call into question whether or not the charity is truly operating for the public benefit. For corporate foundations, and this is the last bit that I would like to talk about today, there are some additional considerations. So corporate foundations are where a company looks to set up a charity that sits alongside the business, usually sharing the name. So for example, if you have a company called Widgets Limited, you might set up Widgets Foundation. And there are some clear advantages from the association on both sides. Now, it's very, very common for companies to set up their own foundations as part of their way of giving back and as part of perhaps an ESG strategy. It's so common, in fact, that the Commission has published guidance on setting up a corporate foundation, and you'll see on the slide there that there is a link to that guidance at the top. I'm just going to briefly take you through some of the key points within that guidance, but if you are here because you're thinking about setting up a foundation alongside your company, I would strongly recommend that you read that guidance before you do anything else. The public benefit requirement that I've just talked about applies to all types of charities, and there are particular considerations for companies. One of the main things that you will obviously recognise is that the charity is going to benefit from the shared use of your brand, but equally, the company will benefit from all of the goodwill that the charity then generates from its activities. Now, the Commission accepts that and is comfortable with that level of benefit. It's incidental to the public benefit you're trying to achieve. But if you do too much, where the charity is really enhancing your business activities, then it could be considered to be more than merely incidental. You cannot set up a foundation alongside a company merely to advance your own agenda. And this brings us on to this requirement for independence and the duties of the charity trustees to operate in the best interests of the charity, independently of what the company's wishes might be. So it is not appropriate for the company to make donations into the charity and dictate how those donations are to be spent. So the charity trustees have to be independent in their decision making about what they use those assets that they have to advance. it's all about control in that respect. And we talked earlier about the options for membership and trustee roles within foundations. There is nothing wrong with the company having some influence, but you have to be very careful about the level of influence. The power to appoint trustees is absolutely fine, but you cannot then expect or require those trustees to take decisions that are what the company has decided it wishes. The trustees have to be free and genuinely operating independently of the company. This is an advantage for a lot of organizations because in many cases you want to take what you're doing in the business. Perhaps you've got intellectual property or other assets, and there are elements of what you're doing within your business that really are for the public benefit and are charitable in nature. And by moving those into a foundation and putting them separately from the company, it creates that degree of independence, and it removes the suggestion that all of those activities are purely self-serving for the company. So there are advantages in having that degree of independence, but it is something you need to carefully consider when you're looking at the governance structure and how you're going to manage the organisation in practice. It's also particularly important to have independent trustees for a corporate foundation, because if you're doing anything that involves any sort of arrangement between the company and the foundation, for example, use of staff time, use of office space, intellectual property and licensing agreements for the use of your name and brand, all of those arrangements need to be entered into on an arm's length basis with management of conflicts of interests. So if you have people who are both directors of the company and trustees of the charity, and there are no other independent trustees, it will be impossible for the charity to make decisions appropriately managing conflicts in terms of entering into those arrangements. So again, as I said, I would read that guidance. It's not very long. It's very, very easy to read if you're thinking about setting up a corporate foundation. And if you have any particular questions, do think about, asking as a preliminary point on those questions before you embark on setting up the foundation. So that's all we've got time for today. So I'm going to bring Jen back now, and we're just going to have a look at any questions that you may like us to answer. And before I do that, I just want to point out that there will be a questionnaire, a feedback form at the end of the webinar that you'll receive. We'd be really grateful if you take the time to fill that out. It does give you an opportunity to let us know about any future topics that you might like to hear from us on, anything that you would like a bit more detail on, and we can build that into our future webinar program. So now, having a little look at questions, Jen, I think there's one there for you about objects and whether or not you can have more than one charitable purpose.
Yeah. And the answer to that is yes, you absolutely can. Our advice would be that you should be careful to perhaps not have too many, as it might become unwieldy, but you can have multiple charitable purposes or objects, and you can actually combine specific charitable purposes with a general catch-all to give you some flexibility or give you a focus of what you're trying to achieve, but then the general charitable purposes object will then give you some flexibility going forward if you think that's something you're likely to need. So yes, you definitely can.
Thanks, Jen. I think I've got another question here about for grant making charities. We were talking, Jen, you were talking earlier about applications and thinking about in your grant making policy accepting applications. And this question is whether or not you have to accept applications. And in fact, you don't. You can set up a grant making charity where the trustees just decide what they want to do. So if you don't want to go through a process where people apply to your charity in accordance with your grant making policy and then you decide between them, and you would prefer to just meet a couple of times a year as a group of trustees and decide for yourselves, maybe you have a really clear idea about the sorts of purposes that you as trustees want to support, and you're quite proactive and you go out and identify those causes and those other charities, that's absolutely fine. There is no obligation as a grant making charity to accept applications, but you would set that out clearly in your grant making policy and make it clear that the way the charity operates is these are the areas we're focusing on, and this is our process. So we decide and then get in touch with recipients. So that's absolutely fine. There's no obligation to do that. I think we've got time for just one more question, which is about investments into a charity, donations into a charity, and whether it's possible to donate shares into a charity as opposed to funds. Yes, the answer is yes. It is common for donors to do this, particularly Jen was talking about setting up a foundation during your lifetime and then leaving all of your wealth to, or a proportion of your wealth to it on your death in your will. Some people do choose to leave shares in their own companies, particularly if they haven't identified another option and they don't want to sell the business. So yes, it is possible to do that. There are some particular considerations to think about, though. Again, when I was talking earlier about trustees making a decision about whether it's appropriate to accept a donation, sometimes when you're receiving shares, the donor might want to give those shares with a condition that they can't be sold. And whilst it's acceptable for trustees to accept them on those terms, the law and the policy of the Charity Commission is that the individual donor, or the person whose consent is required for selling the shares, would then have to make decisions about whether or not the trustees can sell the shares in a fiduciary capacity. So they would have to make that decision acting in the best interest of the charity. And if the trustees felt that they weren't doing so, they could apply to the Commission to lift those restrictions. So it is something you can do, but you have to be a little bit careful, and there isn't a way of forcing a charity to never sell the shares that you donate to them. And on the flip side, the trustees have a lot of important duties in terms of investments and management of investments. So they would need to carefully consider at regular intervals whether it's appropriate to continue holding those shares as part of their diversified portfolio of investments, or whether it would be preferable to sell. So it's quite a big topic, that, but we may do another webinar in the future specifically around investment duties, particularly since the Commission is in the process of updating its CC14 guidance on investments, and I was involved in the working party at the Charity Law Association looking at that guidance. So it's a topic that we're likely to talk about in future. That's all we've got time for today. Thank you very much for joining us. As I said, please fill out the feedback form, and if you've got any other questions that we haven't answered for you today, please accept my apologies and do feel free to fill them in on the feedback form. Thank you.
Thank you.